Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's seminar session, the 11th seminar session in the series titled Curriculum Studies in Canada. My name is Ying Ma, postdoctorate fellow and coordinator for this seminar series. I feel very honored to facilitate today's meeting. Each session will be approximately 1 hour, with the speakers allowed around 40 minutes to give their presentations, followed by a short Q&A segment. With the permission of our speaker, this meeting will be recorded, and they will become available on both our website and the YouTube channel. Today, we are very privileged and very honored to have Dr. Claudia Eppert from University of Alberta to give us a talk titled Ecological Witnessing, Imagination and Transformation in Canadian and ELA Curricula. Now, we're very happy to have Dr. Teresa Strong-Wilson to introduce Dr. Claudia Eppert to us. Welcome.
Thank you, Yingman, and I'm so pleased to be here.
Thank you.
Claudia Eppert is Associate Professor of Curriculum Studies and English Language Arts at the University of Alberta and has been since 2007. Prior to that time, she was Assistant and Associate Professor at Louisiana State University. Her interests lie in situations of injustice and suffering, and the traditions on which she draws are wide-ranging, from feminist to trauma and remembrance to wisdom to psychoanalytic frames of reference. Each of the two books that she has co-edited, Cross-Cultural Studies in Curriculum Eastern Thought, Educational Insights with Wang, and Between Hope and Despair, Pedagogy and the Remembrance of Historical Trauma with Simon and Rosenberg, won book awards, one from AESA, American Educational Studies Association, and the other one from ARA. She has published over 30 articles and book chapters in such journals as New German Critique, Changing English, Studies in Philosophy and Education, Journal of Philosophy of Education, and Journal of the American Association for the Advancement of Curriculum Studies. She has served as co-editor with Daniel Vokey of Philosophical Inquiry and Education, Journal of the Canadian Philosophy of Education Society, for which she co-edited a two-part special issue on the topic of contemplative practices, education and socio-political transformation. She has a special symposium guest edited issue with Jacqueline Bach, which is tentatively forthcoming in the Journal of Curriculum Inquiry titled Questions of Gratitude, Storying Transformative and Curricular Relationships with Women's Experiences and Lives, which is due out before July this year. Her own article for this issue draws upon psychoanalysis, Buddhist thought, and Anishinaabe wisdom in order to engage in complicated conversations regarding what she is calling educations of ecological well-being in the face of anthropogenic climate change. Eppert's recent chapter publications include one entitled Forest Walks in the Anthropocene, Meditations on Grief, Joy, and a Restorative Politics, published in Boosie and Mosini Alistair's edited book, Phenomenologies of Grace, The Body, Embodiment, and Transformative Futures. She also has a book chapter on empire, ecocide, and W.G.C. Bald's And If I Remain by the Outermost Sea, tentatively forthcoming in Unsettling Complacency, Hope, and Ethical Responsibility, which is an edited book, engaging in the writings of W.G.C. Bald from the perspectives of education and architecture, co-edited by Ricardo Castro, Warren Critchlow, Amory Yoder, and myself, Teresa Strong-Wilson. As it happens, this past summer, I was invited to reflect on gratitude in curriculum scholarship and scholars, from which I'll read you a short excerpt from my contribution. The invitation was to a volume called Influences and Inspirations in Curriculum Studies and Teaching, Reflections on the Origin and Legacy of Curriculum Scholarship, which is edited by John Guinea-Yallop, Carmen Shields, and Adam Podolsky, and being published by Routledge in Bill's Curriculum Theory series. Serendipity describes a state of unexpected happiness brought on by accident or as if by accident, which is how I feel in being here, and in being asked by Claudia to introduce her. The term serendipity, first coined by Horace Walpole, was used to describe that happy conditions of heroes who, quote, were making discoveries by accident and by sagacity of things that they were not in quest of. From where I am speaking today, those heroes are readers who, by their own good fortune, come across the work of certain curriculum theorists whose writings enrich their thinking, their sagacity, and that they tend to want to carry with them. W.G. Sebald once expressed his wish to pay respect to those who have faithfully accompanied him in his travels, writers whose books or papers he chose to place in his suitcase or backpack, for whom he had come to hold, as he said, an unwavering affection. And not only because of the subject they wrote about, but because of their manner of carrying themselves in the word and in the world. This is what I'm doing today in introducing Claudia. I'm expressing my gratitude. It was William Pinar who suggested that I should read and talk to Claudia Eppert. There was a delay, as is often is my case. It can take me time to create spaces for what's important to do. Upon reading, Eppert's writings immediately marked me, startling me into thinking in ways I had not yet considered. It took several more years of all too brief meetings at CSSE and missed opportunities for those full-throated conversations that I hoped for to take place. By mutual interest, she attended a talk I gave at McGill at a session of the Provoking Curriculum Conference, as I attended hers, and then, as if by a colossal wave of unlooked-for serendipity, Claudia was a visiting scholar at McGill from January to mid-March 2020 until COVID-19 interrupted. During that interval, short as it was, time viscerally shifted, with her co-presence there over tea, there as I heard her speak at an event, then reflected with her on the event, there in my graduate class as after class we traveled in the same metro car. I am aware that I am where she was before in thinking through difficult conversations around human genocides within education. Her focus has shifted somewhat, however, our talks revealed her abiding concern with sites of injustice and with our entangled implication as human beings. This concern continues to motivate her very deliberate finding of a pathway through difficult questions, but through a slow, inexorable movement, her utterly devastating thinking with its power to disrupt, unravel, and compel thinking anew. Something that is in store for us once again today. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Such a lovely introduction. It's made me emotional. Thank you. Thank you, Bill and Anne, for inviting me to be part of this series. And thanks again, Teresa, for the wonderful introduction, and Ingmar for introducing me today too. Thank you. I'm speaking to you from Treaty 6 territory, the traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others. I've been in Edmonton since 2007. And I'm grateful to be learning a great deal from Indigenous peoples here. Is the volume okay? Today at about 3 p.m. here in Alberta, I noticed that the sun is out and the sky is semi-cloudy, semi-clear. The title for this talk is based on a graduate course I teach called Imagination, Witnessing, and Transformation, Interdisciplinary Explorations of Educational and Ecological Well-Being. And it's lovely to see some of the people in that class here today. In this course, students engage in contemplative, transformative inquiry projects. This year, I have been engaged in my own project, which is to go for regular long walks and have complicated conversations with prairie sunset skies. Behind me is a photo of one such sky. As will become apparent in this talk, attending to the skies may be a critical part of the ethical work of Curriculum Futures. So this paper clocks in at exactly 42 minutes. And I very much consider it a work in progress. I'm still trying to work through these ideas, so I really look forward to your feedback at the end of this talk. Proceeding then with my talk, Introduction. For this series, Bill and Anne suggested that I introduce my intellectual history, then discuss my current curricular preoccupations, and then consider curriculum futures. In terms of background, briefly, my studies in English literature led to studies in literature education, with intersecting interests in history, philosophy, and curriculum. At some point way back, I realized an underlying and what I've now come to recognize as an enduring preoccupation with suffering and trauma, and particularly with questions of ethical engagement, so aptly voiced by Derrida in his Spectres of Marx as questions of learning to live alone and with others. Questions of ethical living have prompted three interrelated and overlapping movements in my scholarly work. The first, spanning the 1990s and early 2000s, focused on historical witnessing through literature and the arts, principally with regard to Holocaust remembrance due to my German heritage, but also with regard to ethical engagements with post-colonial novels. These interests were theoretically informed by select writings of such philosophers as Levinas, Derrida, Simone Weil, and also by forays into psychoanalysis and education. The second movement, spanning the 2000s to more recently, has been focused on mindful and contemplative witnessing. Here, Taoist, Buddhist, Hindu, and other wisdom texts, as well as hermeneutics, became my theoretical locus, along with time spent in meditative practices. Finally, the third movement initially began with Hurricane Katrina in 2005, but has remained latent until more recently. It is focused on ecological witnessing, and I'm keen to root this witnessing, principally in language arts education. Ecological witnessing feels quite new, and the more I learn, the more I realize all there is to learn, especially given the highly interdisciplinary nature of scholarship in this area. There are volumes upon volumes to read, and I have barely scratched the surface. A further thread that underpins and weaves through my interests in historical, mindful, and ecological witnessing relates to questions of transformation to more responsive, caring, and compassionate societies. It is a bit surprising to me that the term witnessing emerges as a constant throughout my intellectual biography. I first spent time with the concept in my readings and rereadings of Shoshana Fellman's and Dory Laub's book, Testimony, Crisis of Witnessing in Literature, Psychoanalysis, and History, first published way back in 1992, when I first began graduate studies in education. It counts as one of my all-time favorite scholarly texts. Indeed, their book regarding Holocaust remembrance so engaged me that decades later, select chapters still pepper the syllabi of my graduate classes. I also reference this book in this paper. So compelling for me in the concept of witnessing is the wrestling with complexities of attention, inattention, knowing, not knowing, understanding, not understanding, engagement, disengagement. According to the OED, witnessing derives from the Old English root wit, variably meaning the seat of consciousness, and also thought, memory, attention, understanding. Attention, inattention is part of what today's paper focuses on. That and also concerns of temporality. In dwelling on Bill and Anne's call to address my past, present, and future, my preoccupations with historical, mindful, and ecological witnessing, I increasingly find past, present, and future inextricably entangled. And I'm particularly experiencing the future as up for question. It is principally the question of the future, of a future, that I seek to wrestle with today. Where are we at? When I think of Nicholas Ingefuk's question, quote, where are we at in this place and this time as Canadian curriculum scholars, unquote, I find myself dwelling with the following in very rough geographical terms. In the north, polar bears, the Atlantic and Pacific walrus, the caribou, the bowhead whale, the narwhal. In the east, the North Atlantic right whale and the Atlantic puffin. In the west, the Vancouver Island marmot, red-legged frog, Oregon spotted frog. And in the central south, the monarch butterfly, the American badger, the bobolink, to name only a few species currently at risk among so many others. In other words, I've been dwelling with questions of extinction, dwelling with these questions during this global pandemic, dwelling with these questions while reading along with countless others Albert Camus' The Plague in preparation for my undergraduate ELA Zoom class, a text whose significance to species at risk in curriculum will soon become apparent. As time allows, I've also been scouring websites, seeking to educate myself more fully about species extinction in Canada. By no means an easy task I am finding, and experiencing shame and despair that I am learning about this and don't already know it, that this isn't in the cultural and educational forefront. I have been learning that Canada is home to 80,000 known species, excluding virus and bacteria, and including the protozoa, chromis, fungi, plant, and animal kingdoms. This comes from wildlifespecies.canada.ca. According to the 2020 Living Planet Report Canada, Wildlife at Risk, between 1970 and 2016, populations of Canadian species assessed as at risk have plunged by an average of 59%, and species assessed as globally at risk have seen their Canadian populations fall by an average of 42%. The report cites that threats are multiple and include overexploitation, invasion and disease, pollution, climate change, urban development, transport, human disturbance, agricultural activity, energy production, system modifications to improve human welfare, and geological events. The report confirms that COVID is also a sign of peril, as it has, quote, at its roots, deep connections to the degradation of habitat. I can't help but note that 1970, the beginning of this plunge, coincides with my beginnings in elementary school. The Living Planet report further states that these stats indicate that current, quote, effort to protect and recover vulnerable wildlife at local, provincial, and national scales are not nearly enough, unquote. And it continues, quote, despite conservation efforts to date, global goals and trajectories for biodiversity conservation, sustainable use of resources, and climate change mitigation are unlikely to be achieved without vigorous, urgent, and transformative action from all sectors of society, unquote. It adds that because Canada ranks second of 5 countries that can, quote, contain more than 70% of the world's remaining intact ecosystems, unquote, Canada thus has, quote, a disproportionate responsibility and opportunity to protect and sustainably manage its intact land and seascapes. It points out that Canada is the steward of 1/4 of the world's remaining areas of high ecological integrity. According to the report, quote, the next decade will be critical in reversing catastrophic wildlife loss and climate breakdown, unquote. So what does this call for high ecological integrity and urgent transformative action mean for curriculum studies in English language arts education? How can we as curriculum scholars and ELA educators help? Returning to Nicholas Ingefook's question, where are we at in this place and this time as Canadian curriculum scholars? It seems to me that we are at a critical place in time of extinction. To think curriculum studies and English language arts education today, I think, is to begin to think these fields in extinction, in times of extinction, with relation both to the threat of the rapid decline of species and also the potential of human extinction. As Dupuy writes, quote, we are living today in the shadow cast by the prospect of catastrophes that separately or in combination threaten to bring about the disappearance of the human race from the earth, unquote. The provocation, indeed, in my view, obligation to think in extinction, both other species and our own, extends beyond Canadian curriculum studies. As the 2019 Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services reports, approximately 1 million plant and animal species in the world are currently threatened with extinction. In what follows, I ponder then, what more fully might it mean to think in extinction in Canadian curriculum and specifically ELA? Extinction studies. Certainly a key provocation of curriculum in times of extinction is to engage in conversations regarding complexities of mourning ecological devastation and past species losses. This includes questions of non-human commemorations and or lack thereof. The emerging field of extinction studies in the environmental humanities observes the importance of considering which species are mourned when, why, and how. As I am learning from Rose Van Duren and Trulu's remarkable edited collection titled Extinction Studies, Stories of Time, Death, and Generations, such a good book. Conversations in this field are situated in the realization that, quote, extinction is never a generic event and is always a multi-contextual phenomenon requiring multidisciplinary modes of encounter and understanding. Unquote. Kerry Wolf, in his foreword to this collection, states that we need to attend deeply to what goes out of the world and what is lost to the world with every loss of a being. He quotes from James Hatley's beautifully written, such a good essay. I just love this book, I highly recommend it. James Hatley's beautifully written essays in this collection about the 1905 extinction of the Japanese Honshu wolf. Wolf is okami in Japanese. Quote, something like okami should not disappear in our time without its departure having been noticed, without its loss mattering, unquote. I wonder, might we not say the same of species in Canada? As the editors of this book further note, quote, extinction is one of the gravest challenges to ethics and action confronting all of us today, even if it does so in varied and diverse ways. The reverberations of our inadequacies are everywhere apparent, unquote. I've also recently begun reading Ursula K. Heise's rich book titled Imagining Extinction, the Cultural Meanings of Endangered Species, in which she argues that quote, biodiversity, endangered species, and extinction are primarily cultural issues, questions of what we value and what stories we tell. I draw brief attention to the landscape of extinction studies in order to emphasize, as Rosenell state, the importance of witnessing, quote, the multifaceted unraveling of forms of life that is occurring all around us. Like so many others, I believe this is critical not only for environmental humanities, but also for curriculum studies and English language arts education. I further believe an additional critical component of witnessing is an in tandem unraveling of temporalities. While this can take myriad forms, my current interest is with the question of the kind of present that is enabling conditions for staggering species declines. A present, in other words, that is, as previously mentioned, putting the future of future, the humans and non-humans, into question. Having now introduced extinction studies, let me venture a bit further down this path of a troubling present and future. Staying with the trouble in curriculum studies. Donna Haraway emphasizes the interdisciplinary imperative of, quote, staying with the trouble in times of anthropogenic climate change. She writes that in these times, quote, the task is to become capable with each other of response. To become capable of response, in other words, to meet the disproportionate responsibility for ecological integrity we as Canadians bear, as the Living Planet Report states, for Haraway entails a staying with the trouble that, quote, requires learning to be truly present. I note that in her highlighting of the present, in her advocations for staying with the trouble, Haraway largely rejects the future, asserting that, quote, in urgent times, many of us are tempted to address trouble in terms of making an imagined future safe, of stopping something from happening that looms in the future, of clearing away the present and the past in order to make futures for coming generations. Staying with the trouble does not require such a relationship to times called the future. Unquote. Curriculum theorizing has itself generatively critiqued and sought wrestings away from troublesome futures. Indeed, it has challenged educations whose histories and currencies have been and are thoroughly and linearly embedded in educating for the future, a progressive future in which all time is projected onto a tomorrow that promises to be better than today, but never really arrives. See, for example, David Smith's discussion of what he calls frozen futurism. It has also variably emphasized the importance of being present, what David Jardine, for example, valuably describes as whiling, a worthwhile curriculum that interrupts destructive industrial temporalities and trajectories. And certainly, there's a great deal of ecological scholarship currently stressing the significance of staying with the present, variably focused on cultivating present attentiveness, emphasizing, for instance, ecological awareness, the arts of noticing and witnessing. For me, yes, being present, staying with the trouble, abiding in the here and now rings absolutely key as a subversive, if not revolutionary curriculum in these times, especially from my perspectives of my studies and practices in mindful witnessing. That said, in slight contrast to Haraway, I do find myself preoccupied these days with questions of possibilities of preventing something from happening that looms in the future. As such, I'm currently additionally wanting to give more time and space to the future, not to disavow it, but rather to hold it open, to hold open a relationship with the future, not an absolute, but a relative future, not a future not frozen, but alive, full of imagination and transformative potencies. So as a quick aside, I should say that Haraway does introduce kainos as non-conventional temporalities that include a kind of becoming with, but there isn't time to discuss that today. Interestingly, it is the very challenge of the present, of staying with the trouble, that calls me to questions of the future. Centrally at issue for me is the recognition that the present has been and continues to be characterized by what Haraway describes in later pages as, quote, an unprecedented looking away. In other words, what I'm interested in ecological witnessing is not only staying present to climate change, in the present, indeed, an unprecedented present, but I'm also puzzling with questions of being present to not being present. And I wonder if this educational challenge might not be well served by the future, by futures thinking. That is to say, I'm interested not in an either or, present or future, but rather a both and. At stake in this puzzling is no less than imagining possibilities for responsivity, for responsibility. There is more to wrestle with here than time allows. So below I signal beginnings in revision. Shadow readings. As I debate temporalities, I find myself returning to the past, to texts such as Fellman and Laub's testimony, reading them with anthropogenic climate change in mind. I do so not to compare, contrast, or conflate events of human-initiated mass destruction, but rather to pose additional questions, to read alongside their intended readings. Engaging this process has me debating what I'm inclined to call shadow readings. Shadow readings as opening to questions of the future and inclusive of the present and past. Shadow readings as part of a curriculum for these times of extinction. The term has two inspirations. The first is from Simon and Armitage Simon's article, 1999 article, Teaching Risky Stories, Remembering Mass Destruction Through Children's Literature. In it, they introduced the notion of shadow texts, namely, quote, secondary narratives constructed in response to the unresolved questions a primary narrative elicits. More specifically, shadow texts are unresolved questions that arise in encounters with testimonies of mass destruction. Questions such as, quote, why did people let these events happen? Unquote. While Simon and Armitage Simon focus on historical testimonies, namely testimonies regarding the Nazi genocide of European Jewry and the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and such picture books as Faithful Elephants or Daniel's Story. I contemplate shadow readings as preoccupied with unresolvable questions regarding the present and the future. Along these lines, the second inspiration for shadow readings is responsive to Dupuis' statement that we are currently living in the shadow not only of past, but also future destruction. Indeed, by many accounts, young people today are experiencing considerable despair concerning the present and the future, particularly the future. Unresolved questions here are phrased in multiple tenses, namely, why have and why are people letting climate change, climate catastrophe happen? Will people act in the present, in the future? Will there even be a future? Unresolved questions are at the forefront of select children's picture books that struggle with narrating species extinction, such as, for example, Alexander Wright's and Marshall Peck's III's Will We Miss Them? Endangered Species, or Chelsea Clinton's and Gianna Marino's more recent Don't Let Them Disappear, 12 endangered species across the globe. Interestingly, while the second text assumes a conventional linear temporality, situating itself in the present and imploring young readers not to let species disappear in the future, the former text is a bit more evocative. It can be read dually. First, as the question of will we miss extinct species in some undetermined future, and it can also be read as asking readers in some ways to imagine themselves into a future and consider from within that future whether they are missing endangered species. In other words, within this question of mourning or perhaps melancholia from within the future is another unresolved question, a shadow question from potentially a spectral, ghostly future, if humans are also no more, directed to the past that is our present, namely, did people let these events happen? And also, what if they didn't? Shadow readings, shadow questions reveal anxieties of not being present and return me to another text by Shoshana, another beloved text by Shoshana Fellman, namely her book, Jack Lacan and the Adventure of Insight. In it, Fellman draws on Lacan, who in turn, according to Renata Salsel, was inspired by Buddhist lectures on ignorance as one of the three fires or poisons in order to consider educations implicated in, quote, passions of ignorance, unquote. Fellman describes ignorance not as, quote, a passive state of absence, a simple lack of information, unquote, but rather as, quote, an active dynamic of negation, an active refusal of information. The question of will we miss them is not only a question of melancholy or mourning, but also the question of missing, as in passing by, not seeing, not being present to. It implicates the present precisely in ignorance, that is, precisely in an unprecedented looking away. Fellman maintains that while traditional pedagogy postulates desires for knowledge, what she terms revolutionary pedagogies require attending not to lack of knowledge, but rather to performative desires to ignore, to, quote, resistances to knowledge. Attending to these resistances, I contemplate, might open to a holding open of the future, a radical future. English language arts education and Camus' The Plague. Resistances to ecological knowledge are rife in the English language arts curriculum. In her 2013 article titled The Greening of the Language Arts, Considering Sustainability Outside of the Science Classroom, US scholar Lauren McClanahan remarks, according to Glotfelty, upon reading the current literature canon, quote, you'd never suspect that the Earth's life support systems were under stress. Indeed, you might never know that there was an Earth at all. McClanahan notes that in secondary literature classrooms, where students consider how ethics impact their moral and spiritual lives, quote, we have fairly well ignored our impact on the natural world or our relationships with it, unquote. McClanahan's criticisms certainly apply, for example, to the current secondary Alberta English language arts programs of studies, conceived in 2003. The program emphasizes the importance on reflecting on, quote, fundamentals of human existence and grappling, quote, with the intricacies of the human condition, but nowhere mentions what US ELA curriculum theorist Mary Aswell-Dahl already in 2000 identified as a necessary greening of the imagination. As McClanahan contends, what such omissions implicitly tell English language arts students is that, quote, our ecological relationship with our habitat is either a matter of little importance or something only relevant to science geeks, unquote. Earlier, I mentioned that I read Camus' The Plague during this pandemic year for my undergraduate class. For those unfamiliar with it, the novel was published in 1947 and tells the story of characters' experiences of living through a plague in the French Algerian town of Oran. The novel is roughly based on a cholera epidemic that killed many inhabitants of Oran in the mid-1800s, although the novel itself is set in the 1940s. The novel's protagonist is medical doctor Bernard Rieu, who cares for the sick. Rieu and other key characters, among them a journalist, a wanderer, a town clerk, and a Jesuit priest, each grappled differently with questions of ethical responsibility during the quarantine. The novel has been interpreted as an allegory for the French resistance to Nazi occupation during the Second World War. Teaching the current ELA program of studies, I am reminded of the beginning of the novel, in which the narrator describes Oran as a town focused on commerce, a town, quote, without pigeons, without any trees or gardens, where you never hear the beat of winds or the rustle of leaves, unquote. Shifts, however, are beginning to happen due to young people's activism, ELA teachers' own individual initiatives. See, for example, the 2020 CBC What on Earth series that featured an episode titled How to Talk with Kids About Climate Change. Vital activism taking place in organizations such as the Alberta Council of Environmental Education, research initiatives regarding climate change education, and ELA learning from Indigenous wisdom and ways of knowing, and much more. That said, societal looking away persists. Here in Alberta, among numerous other environmental issues, looking away means disregard for the endangered swift fox, bison, sage grouse, piping plover, Ward's kangaroo rat, whooping crane, mountain plover, and 10 others. The 2017 Alberta Conservation Committee lists 17 endangered plant and animal species, 16 threatened species, and 17 species of special concern. According to the David Suzuki Foundation, across Canada, currently, quote, 521 plant and animal species are considered at risk under Canada's Species at Risk Act. The Plague has been on my bucket list of readings for a long time, not only because Fellman takes it up in her and Laub's testimony, but also because another woman whose work I've deeply admired discusses it, namely American aesthetics educator Maxine Green, 1917 to 2014. Both Fellman and Green reference the plague in order to not only draw attention to unprecedented looking away, but also to inspire and incite transformation. Green's article, "What Are the Language Arts For?", which continues to appear on our undergraduate ELA syllabus, reminds readers that while the 20th century saw significant scientific and technological advances, it also witnessed fanaticism and genocide. Green opens her article with reference to Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel's observation that, quote, "We are all on a train that is running towards a precipice," unquote. And she admonishes readers, ELA teachers, to hear Wiesel's call for human senses of responsibility to steer, quote, "events toward the sun and not toward the abyss." Green contends that if we do not hear Wiesel's address for ethical responsibility, then we are, quote, "likely to become like the citizens of Oran and Camus' The Plague, people caught in the habitual, preoccupied with doing business." In Green's eyes, the citizens of Oran, quote, "lack imagination, the capacity to look at things as if they could be otherwise." Deploying the plague then as a metaphor, Green provokes teachers to, quote, "see beyond and move beyond the classroom," unquote, and bear witness to widespread pestilences, including, among other injustices and abuses, the desertification of the earth and the commodification of children and their education into economic competitiveness. Green writes, quote, "It may be extreme to compare all of this with the pestilence or plague, but we know well that children and young people suffer in the thousands from the separation or the exile Camus' narrator saw as the most fearful consequence of the plague. They may experience it through abandonment, through absence of community, through a felt erosion of concern." Green urges an education in which ELA teachers, rather than being seduced by business as usual preoccupations, debate, quote, "their own being in the world," quote, and enable the young to, quote, "summon up or invent or imagine alternative possibilities for themselves." Unquote. She implores language arts educators to teach in ways that challenge technocratic hegemonies, that release the imagination and cultivate wide awakeness. Defining wide awakeness, she quotes Alfred Schultz, who describes it as originating in an attitude of full attention to life and its requirements. Unquote. Green's attention to looking away and not looking away in English language arts returns me to the present pandemic and the Living Planet report confirming COVID's roots and deep connections to the degradation of habitat. In my undergraduate class this last semester, students who read Camus' novel as part of their literature circle were surprised to learn of the remarkable similarities between Camus' description of responses to the plague and contemporary societal responses to the current pandemic. They read McClanahan's article and decried the absence of ecological attention in the program of studies. Their life writing assignments, composed of creative personal responses to anthropogenic climate change, struggled with shadow questions directed to governments, institutions, educations, texts, themselves, and the future. Fellman herself examines Camus' novel because, she writes, it exemplifies challenges of human conscience in contemporary times. And it also explores, quote, "problems of a radical and necessary transformation," unquote, with regard to historical and ethical categories. Fellman reads the novel as a metaphor for the Holocaust and observes that the plague explores how the townspeople did not want to admit the event of the plague, precisely because it, quote, "does not enter and cannot be framed by an existing frame of reference, be it of knowledge or belief," unquote. Fellman quotes from Camus, quote, "In this respect, our townsfolk were like everybody else, wrapped up in themselves. In other words, they were humanists. They disbelieved in pestilences," unquote. To respond to Fellman's critique, then, is to believe in pestilences and no longer be humanists. As I state elsewhere, to no longer be humanists is to hear educational philosopher Jane Roland Martin's words regarding the imperative for, quote, "a sea change in the way we think about ourselves in relation to the planet we inhabit. Itself not a simple matter. and also the re-education of dominant attitudes, values, feelings, emotions, patterns of behavior, and modes of living. In these words, Martin adds her voice to an ever-growing cacophony of sages, philosophers, scientists, activists, artists, elders, and educators throughout the southern and northern hemispheres who have called and are now calling for seismic educational transformation in recognition of not only extensive environmental uses and abuses, but also concurrent histories of cultural genocide against Indigenous peoples. In my view, a key purpose of the language arts today with regard to anthropogenic climate change is to inquire into and participate in seismic transformation, to challenge existing normative frames of reference, to explore interdependencies with the environment, to read and compose human beings not as insular and separate, but rather relational and interconnected, to learn about, bear witness, and respond to climate catastrophe, to learn deeply from Indigenous wisdom and ways of knowing, to become ecologically and multi-species aware and entangled, to be responsive to diverse political, racial, spiritual, queer, gendered, and other ecologies, to imagine and compose diverse stories of alternate presents and futures, and much more. Back to the future, floods, catastrophes, and prophecies. Much earlier in this paper, I quoted contemporary philosopher Jean-Pierre Dupuy, who wrote, quote, "We are all living today in the shadow cast by the prospect of catastrophes that, separately or in combination, threaten to bring about the disappearance of the human race from the earth." It is in reading selections from his, quote, "A short treatise on the metaphysics of tsunamis," unquote, that I began to recognize the layers of the children's book, Will We Miss Them? And how literary response, and indeed curriculum studies and ELA education, might unlock conventional futures and invite radical reimaginings. Let me elaborate. In the early pages of his short treatise, Dupuy draws attention to 20th century German Jewish philosopher Günther Anders' original telling of the flood, in which Noah becomes fatigued with being, quote, "a prophet of doom," unquote, who no one takes seriously. Anders describes Noah as consequently in protest, dressing himself in mourning clothes, that is grieving and tired, not early morning, and returning to the city where a small crowd gathers. The crowd asks him who died, and Noah replies that they themselves did, even though the catastrophe in which they died would take place only after Noah spoke to them. Having thus caught their attention, Noah announces that 2 days after speaking to them, the flood, quote, will be something that will have been, unquote. In other words, it will have happened. And at that time, quote, "everything that is will never have existed. It will be too late to remember, for there will no longer be anyone alive. And so there will be no longer any difference between the dead and those who mourn them." The curricular performative significance of Anders' telling for curriculum studies and language arts is clear. To name these fields in extinction is not only to forewarn of future destruction, but to dress in mourning and generatively announce education as something that will have been and which has ceased to exist as a means of undressing unprecedented looking away and facilitating transformation. In ways that resonate closely with Thelman's reading of the plague, Dupuy writes that, quote, "the prophet of doom is not heard because his words, even if they issue from secure knowledge and true information, do not manage to penetrate the system of beliefs held by those to whom they are addressed." He adds that, quote, "our ability not to see when faced with the obviousness of suffering and atrocities is the principal obstacle that the prophet of doom must at least find a way around, if he cannot actually overcome it." Unquote. As Dupuy observes, in his continuation of Anderson's retelling, after Noah returns home, he is visited by both a carpenter and a roofer who seek to help Noah build an ark so that Noah's words will become false. In other words, Noah's performative deconstruction of conventional temporality worked. In order to be present to an unprecedented looking away, Noah does not image the future from the present, but rather challenges his audience to contemplate the present from within the future. In other words, unprecedented looking away and its consequences is looked back upon. This looking back upon carries the potential to enable looking, to being present and taking action. Returning to the Living Planet report, citing Canada's responsibility, I once again cite Dupuy, who writes, "We must keep two things in mind at once, the possibility of catastrophe and the possibly cosmic responsibility that falls to humanity of trying to avert this catastrophe." He does talk later that it's not all up to humans, so it's not positioning the human as hero here. Unquote. For Dupuy, in ways that resonate with Haraway's and Smith's critique of temporalities, responsibility is enabled in releasing an imagination, to invoke Green's phrase, from within a future that precisely critiques transformative initiatives embedded in linear and progressive temporalities. In this way, Dupuy, like Haraway, states that our duty is not to future generations, which is embedded in logics of progress, but rather, quote, to ourselves here and now, unquote. In this regard, curriculum as the interdisciplinary study of educational experience and language arts education, specifically in Extinction, might in manifold, multidimensional and creative ways work play on imagining and composing alternate lived futures from unresolved shadow questions, so that the present is released from its ignorance and bears the potential to create a present that the future can paradoxically recognize as a catastrophe never having happened, but always remaining as if it, according to Dupuy, could have happened. In a way that is a bit contrary to Haraway, a relationship with the future, thus, for Dupuy is needed. Dupuy states, whether or not the future has any need of us, we, for our part, need the future, for it is the future that gives meaning to everything that we do, unquote. All this returns me to the sunset sky image behind me. Reading the Plague, or Questions of Forecast. In seeking to learn more about Camus' The Plague, I recently came across a brilliant article by James Gorley on this novel titled Trapped by Climate Change, in which he compellingly draws upon Dupuy's work in order to read The Plague in the context of anthropogenic climate change. It is a fascinating article because, contrary to more common human-centered readings, it considers the way in which the novel variably attends to the weather. Gorley adopts Jennifer May Hamilton's focus on the historically situated interpretive practice of meteorological readings. Gorley notes that reading the forecasts can be anxiety-filled and vexed, and this is precisely how the weather becomes read by the townspeople of Camus' Oran following their being quarantined. The townspeople search the skies for a sign. During the solitary pandemic, in my contemplative transformative inquiry pandemic project of numerous complicated winter sunset conversations, I too have searched the skies for signs, despairingly realizing also in the process, among numerous other insights, just how little I actually know about skies, or sunsets for that matter. What is further fascinating about Gorley's article is that he observes, through reading the novel's changing representation of the weather, transformations happening in the townspeople as the novel progresses, transformations in how they relate to the non-human world, transformations responsive to Martin's revolutionary call. I too, in observing the sunset, have noticed shifts happening in me. Gorley notes from Camus' representation of the sky, and one might add, quote, violent extremes of temperature, quote, that at the beginning of the novel, Oran is a town, quote, trapped by climate change. Unquote. The skies forewarn of a plague to come, but the residents of Oran, including the novel's protagonist and narrator Ryu, are unable to, quote, read the premonitory signs of the grave events to follow, unquote. Because as Gorley knows, citing Dupuy, this would mean reckoning with the consequences. The town largely remains passive, turning its back on the weather. Gorley draws parallels here in regard to current anthropogenic climate change catastrophe And I might add, there are further parallels to be drawn with respect to ELA curricula. Gourley proceeds to illustrate how quarantine and increasing devastation, however, prompts the townspeople as they become more subject to the non-human world via the rats and fleas transmitting the plague, for example, to become more conscious of sky, sun, and rain. They become increasingly distressed by their vulnerability to the weather. Gourley observes that as the novel continues, although the townspeople begin to feel more threatened by the climate, they largely continue on with their lack of understanding. Gourley further writes, quote, "Perception of their sudden powerlessness overlooks their historical disinterest in anything but the human world and their rigid separation of human and non-human worlds. The Orane seek to reassert their primacy over the non-human world, a model of relation that clearly does not fully understand the reality of the plague epidemic, nor does it approach harmony or equilibrium, which would promote a possible long-term coexistence," unquote. Even though the townspeople are beginning to develop awareness of their connection to the non-human world, their passion for ignorance persists, as too does their lack of attention to the future. Camus states, quote, "This drastic, clean-cut deprivation and our complete ignorance of what the future held in store had taken us unawares." As Gourley notes with reference to the novel, the plague rules out any possible futures. The townspeople continue with a business as usual present that obviates the future. Yet Gourley then brings attention to the ways in which, as the plague more fully grips the townspeople, their relationship to the non-human world begins to transform. For the first time, they become observant, noticing the smells of the soil, the changing seasons, the nature of the sky. Gourley writes, quote, "The Orane's experience of the plague epidemic serves as a prompt for the townspeople to re-engage with the non-human world, to understand themselves as part of an ecosystem that extends beyond their own small city and its mundane aspirations. The townspeople thus slowly and in the face of much ambivalence begin to learn, although it is not until the end of the novel, Gourley observes, that these lessons are fully realized, with the arrival of a change of weather. In other words, it is the weather rather than human actions entirely that beckons the end of the plague. Gourley makes the important point that in contrast to the novel, anthropogenic climate change requires action. Still, Gourley beautifully shows how the novel comes to make evident human dependence upon the non-human world and the interdependence between human and non-human. In other words, it seems the townspeople of Iran participate precisely in the educational revolution Martin and also Fellman point to as necessary. They have come to believe in pestilences and are no longer humanists. Gourley draws upon Dupuy in order to thus show the importance of, quote, "speaking of the unpalatable truth so as to resist our ability not to see when faced with the obviousness of suffering and atrocities." Unquote. Passions for ignorance require ongoing and persistent challenging. Gourley reads Camus' novel as inviting this challenging, as having the ability to stimulate, quote, "the thinking of an enlightened doomsayer, a figure who tells of the catastrophe to come and precipitates action which renders this catastrophe no longer real." Unquote. The plague, and we might also include the children's book, Will We Miss Them Here, in Gourley's words, quote, "prompts its reader to think more seriously about the present, to treat the future as if it impacted upon us." Unquote. Conclusion. Curriculum Futures and the Provocations of Language Arts Education. A cautionary conclusion. While Dupuy's scholarship points to the possible performance of curriculum and ELA educators as enlightened doomsayers, a current era of fake news questions the wisdom of engaging in false witnessing. Dupuy acknowledges challenges to his writing, and Gourley attends to these as well. But in so doing, Gourley posits the potential of literature to become the generative site for enlightened doomsaying. We might regard language arts curriculum more generally as also providing rich opportunities along these lines. Language arts classrooms might engage in reading picture books such as Will We Miss Them and novels such as The Plague, text that, as Gourley recommends, shows people not acknowledging and responding to catastrophe. Such classrooms and readings can become a generative venue for subversive learning from such fiction and for complex conversations regarding shadow questions. They can also become vital avenues for imagining and composing relational ontoepistemologies with capacities to contest what Worley describes as, quote, present-day climate change inertia, unquote. Finally, such classrooms can also in multifaceted ways participate in what philosopher Simone Weil describes as a gymnastics of attention, a gymnastics that might, among other possibilities, for example, look to the skies and read the weather. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eppert, for your very powerful and beautiful speech. And right now we're open for questions and comments. So you could unmute yourself and make your comments or raise your questions.
Claudia, I have a question, if I can jump in right away. Thank you so much, Claudia, for your presentation, for your points. I never thought of Albert Camus' The Plague, the way that you brought it in our present pandemic or even our present ecological situation. So this has given me lots to think about because I love that novel. I used to teach that novel, so I'm really glad to be reminded of it. My question has to do with the concept of extinction. And I've wrestled with this, and I don't really have an answer for this. I'm still thinking about it a lot. And as you know, extinction is a normal part of the history of evolution. Species become extinct and new species arrive. And so in some sense, ecological catastrophe means kind of intervening in an evolutionary process. And how do we know which species are destined to die out anyway, and which ones are not because of human action? And I don't know if you thought about these questions or wondered about them, but I struggle with it a lot because we can't save everything. I'm not even sure we should be saving everything. So that makes the question of ethics that much more complicated, I think. I wondered what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I agree. I don't have any answers along those lines, but I do know that the books that I've been reading, like Extinction Studies and the other one, Imagining Extinction, they both talk about that same thing. And they wrestle with it. They also wrestle with the language of extinction. You know, it's kind of an abstract and personal kind of phrasing. So yeah, I don't have an answer. I'm struggling as well. I do think it's important that we start to think about commemorating species. Certainly that's not much in the landscape of our memorials and whatnot, right? So yeah, and how we might also complicate the language of mourning. Everywhere I'm seeing the language of mourning being used, but I wonder what other kind of languages might be used to describe loss. Thank you for bringing up that point too.
So I saw Laura. Do you have a question?
I do. Thank you. I guess I can turn my camera on. One of the classes I'm taking this semester, we're talking about many of the things that you talked about. And we've come around to it. It's the end of the semester, been talking about it for a while. We're kind of frustrated. It's all theory, it's all theory, it's all theory. And you hinted at that a few different times throughout your talk. What about the action? When does the action come into play? And when do we start actually responding to the loss of species in your case, or climate change, justice, and all that kind of stuff? So I'm wondering if you have ideas or thoughts or questions about the focus on theory, the not enough action, and how do we get to that action?
Thank you for your question, Laura. Yeah, so just last week I was at this meeting, and I'm just forgetting the name of the Alberta Environmental Education Group. And they're participating in action on all kinds of ways, really trying to make sure that climate change sort of becomes a part of the program of studies. So there is all kinds of activism that is beginning to happen. It's just, is there enough activism happening, right? And is it happening quickly and responsibly and with ecological integrity? So yeah, I think a lot of people today are feeling frustrated with the lack of sufficient action, and also with a lot of the abstraction it's something that I'm sort of been wrestling with too in the graduate course that I've been teaching this semester. Is, you know, how do we move away from abstraction, even just simply in our writing, you know, to bring more life to our writing, to bring more connection to our writing. So yeah. Then, do you have any suggestions in terms of action?
I'd love if all the kids were involved and, you know, all the students were doing it, but that's just not realistic. So we've been talking about in the class starting locally to maybe like this example you gave, starting locally to respond to the issues and then considering the more global implications. So that's maybe what we will do as a class, but thank you.
In our class, in our graduate class, one of the things that we've been emphasizing is, you know, these contemplative, transformative projects. It's something that I feel pretty strongly about, is that simply developing our relationship with the land, getting to know more, getting to have a closer relationship to the land, of practicing a gymnastics of attention itself is a significant transformative activity.
Thank you, Claudia. And Tada, you have a question?
Hi, I just thank you, Claudia, for inviting me to your seminar today. I'm so glad that you did. I was thinking a lot when you were talking about the context that we discussed in the class I taught about the shadow texts and shadow stories. And I was trying to figure out how we get out of the reactionist world into the activist world to help students see that in our curricula when we're talking language arts or English language arts. And I fully embrace and love the context of these powerful children's picture books to show the extent of these messages that we want to bring to these students when they're looking at what they consider the human experience. And how do we both embrace what was gone, for example, in Whistle's work, when he talks about his life in the concentration camps, to help them see that it's more about patterns and things that we've created in our worlds than about specific events, that we're going to keep doing what we've always done unless we find a way to alter that pattern. And I was looking at your background because I found it so profound. For me, it was like the sky is contesting things that are going on. One half is so dark and the other half is light and airy. And in the very bottom of it is this hint of perhaps a sunrise or a new dawn. So how do we go from that reactionist world that most of us grew up in and lived in education to the activist zone?
Yeah, it's another complicated question. I don't have much answers for the how-tos in terms of any prescriptive ways. I do remember Bill introducing me a long time ago to, I forget the name of the book. Bill, maybe you remember Marilyn Doerr's autobiography, or Curricula, that was focused on water, environmental autobiography or something along those lines.
It's a tough one. It's a huge question. Sometimes I wish I was still in that classroom where I could be, changing things, or at least thinking that I was changing things. But it's so beautiful to be on this end of it with the other teachers. So.
Marilyn Doerr talks about that the first challenge is to create awareness. By creating awareness and supporting immersion, then you create. She documented these students' experiences of engaging water over a period of a year. So it was focusing on awareness and immersion, and then that brings caring, and caring then has the potential to bring action.
Interesting. Thank you so much for the great stuff. Loved it.
So Lorna Ray, I think, go ahead.
Hi, Claudia. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I always love listening to you. I just wanted to comment on the people who are asking how to get involved and from a school perspective. So through the pandemic, I have spent almost 300 days living in Canmore, and I live in a community called Three Sisters. And currently there is it's called Three Sisters Mountain Village proposal that will upset the wildlife corridor. They're proposing 14,500 new properties. And so this has been going on back and forth for a number of years, but there's opportunities, I would think. There's a lot of literature on, it's the Canmore Commons or through Canmore's community site that discusses what the implications are for the wildlife here, and how by destroying their corridor, we would upset not only the ecology of their, well, the whole ecology of how these animals live in the mountain range, pretty much from here all the way to Alaska. So when we're considering, you know, development for tourism, for well, other aspects to bring economic impact into a community, there's so much more. And I think there's lots of opportunities for the school kids to be able to look at, you know, even if it's just a slice of how it's going to impact the corridor, the animals that are living and playing and surviving together there, how that might impact them. So I just wanted to bring that forward because there is a lot of literature that's supported by a lot of research that's available for students in the classroom. And it's a beautiful place to live. I don't want to see it upset.
It's a constant battle. And it would be lovely to see, you know, a program of study that really supports inquiry, ecological inquiry at all levels, and ecological activism. I mean, if all the students, I think one student in my graduate class said that, made that comment, you know, if all students from all grade levels brought their attention to bear and their activism to bear upon things that are happening in this province. I mean, if that was supported and invited, all the challenges that could, all the changes that could take place. I think today, I'm not sure, but I think today a draft of the new curriculum came out. Very skills based, lots of attention to Greek, but there was one recognition of land as text, which I thought was interesting. I just want to speak to the chats here. Did anyone catch the title of the book? At the start of the talk, it's Crises of Witnessing by Shoshana Fellman and Dory Laub. I think with David Blade, makes the comment, good question, Evan. I sometimes think that the challenge is like fighting injustice, too huge, too nebulous. Perhaps focusing on one species is a start to conceptualize the situation, and also perhaps avenues of action. Yeah, one of the things that I like so much in that book on Extinction Studies is that each author, and they're such good writers, focuses on one animal that's become extinct and then sort of traces their life. That's exactly what I was sort of thinking myself, you know, just choose one. Everybody chose one, that would be great. And they just sort of trace the life of that species and learn more about its habitats and its struggles. I'm really big on gymnastics of attention, you know, the small, being attentive to our own, becoming mindful of our own resistances, learning to pay more attention to the non-dualism between inner and outer, paying attention to our immediate local surroundings, starting to learn it, developing an intimate relationship with it. You know, I think these are all powerful things, in addition to activism of protests and all of that as well.
Thank you very much for speaking to the chat's questions and discussions. I think we have time to accommodate one more question by Robert. So go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I'm just in the car. I'm not driving, but hopefully the volume is okay. Thank you so much, Claudia, for the invitation to your wonderful presentation. Always thought-provoking, as usual. One of the things I'm wondering about, and kind of the intersection of your presentation and my own contemplations, Haraway published a piece recently, and the title of it is It Matters What Stories Tell Stories, and it matters whose stories tell stories. And thinking about Thomas King's notion of stories, and George Tinker's piece from a few years ago about the stones shall cry out. and then listening to Professor Dwayne Donald talking about stories, and then thinking about stories in the context of the ELA classroom, I'm wondering if literary engagement is insufficient, is kind of where I'm at right now. If literary engagement is limiting how we classify story as only from a human perspective, from only human storytellers, and dawning on me very late, I guess, the realization that the very structures of school and education prevent us from engaging, I think, in a broad way, stories of the land, and being able to listen to the stories of our rocks and water and the trees. And I'm wondering if until education is able to invite students to encounter those kinds of stories from those kinds of authors, if it, and not relational in that sense, of like Wakotoan, of being in relations with our human and non-human brothers and sisters. It's more of a rumination, perhaps less of a question, but wondering about your thoughts on that and the possibilities. How realistic might it be to envision education that invites those kinds of encounters with different storytellers that we don't always read?
Thank you, Robert. It's a little bit difficult to hear you, but I think I get the gist. And thank you, Lana, for your comment and question earlier. Yeah, there's a wonderful book that I've been reading called, Alex, if you're still here, maybe you remember the name of it, called The Mushroom at the End of the World by Anna Tsing. It's such a wonderful book, and that's along the lines of what she talks about as well, you know, multi-species stories. I think that one of the challenges that we face right now is to get out of the sense of the, you know, the human skin as a boundary between human and non-human worlds, right? And start to recognize our emotions, our spirits, everything is interdependent with the living world, the animated world. And part of that, I think, starts to involve starting to learn from species and plants and animals about the stories that they have and the stories that they tell about how to be with each other and different kinds of interconnectedness and that sort of thing. Yeah, so I think, yeah, we need to learn from rocks and water and trees and so on as part of the curriculum. I think that's essential. And I do think in some ways we need to get outside of books as well in the English language arts curriculum.
Great. So in the interest of time, so I think I need to close today's session. And I hope to thank Dr. Claudia Eppert again for her very wonderful and intriguing speech. And also I want to thank all of you for the wonderful discussions we have just had. And my thanks to Dr. William Piner and Dr. Anne Phelan for hosting this seminar series. And our next session is scheduled on April 29th, 2021. We look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.